The Library of Alexandria was not burned down in a single dramatic fire. That is one of history's most persistent myths, a story so satisfying in its tragedy that people have been repeating it for centuries without checking whether it actually happened. The truth is stranger, and in many ways, sadder. The library died slowly, over the course of several hundred years, through a combination of budget cuts, political neglect, religious conflict, and the gradual evaporation of the intellectual culture that had sustained it. No single villain destroyed it. It simply stopped mattering to the people in charge. The library was founded around 280 BCE under the first Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, Greek kings who inherited the country after Alexander the Great's death. Ptolemy I and his son Ptolemy II wanted Alexandria to be the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, and they pursued that goal with extraordinary aggression. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were searched, and any scrolls found on board were confiscated, copied, and sometimes the copies were returned while the originals stayed in the library. Ptolemy III reportedly borrowed the official Athenian copies of the great tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, paid an enormous deposit as a guarantee of return, and then kept the originals and sent back the copies, forfeiting the deposit. The library was built through ambition, money, and a willingness to steal. At its peak, the library may have held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, though ancient estimates vary wildly, and some scholars believe the higher numbers were propaganda. What mattered more than the raw count was who worked there. The library was attached to the Mouseion, a research institution funded by the Ptolemaic crown, where some of the greatest minds of the ancient world lived, worked, and argued. Euclid wrote his Elements there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth to within a few percent of the actual value, using nothing but shadows, geometry, and a man walking between two cities. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, 17 centuries before Copernicus. Herophilus performed the first systematic human dissections and mapped the nervous system. The density of genius per square meter may never have been matched. The decline began not with fire, but with politics. In 145 BCE, Ptolemy VIII expelled foreign scholars from Alexandria during a political purge, scattering the intellectual community across the Mediterranean. The library continued to function, but the ecosystem of funded research and debate that made it productive began to thin. When Julius Caesar fought in Alexandria in 48 BCE, a fire near the harbor destroyed a warehouse of scrolls awaiting export, not the library itself, though later writers conflated the two events into one dramatic catastrophe. The real damage came in stages over the following centuries. Roman rule shifted patronage away from the Mouseion. Christianity's rise brought a new hostility toward pagan learning, and in 391 CE, a Christian mob destroyed the Serapeum, a temple complex that housed a secondary collection of library texts. The mathematician Hypatia, one of the last prominent scholars associated with Alexandrian intellectual life, was murdered by a Christian mob in 415 CE. By that point, the library as an institution had been effectively dead for decades, its funding gone, its scholars dispersed, its scrolls deteriorating without maintenance or copying. The Arab conquest of Egypt in 642 CE produced another popular destruction myth. The story claims that the Caliph Omar ordered the remaining scrolls burned, saying that if they agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, They were dangerous. This account first appears 300 years after the supposed event and is widely regarded by historians as fabricated. By the time the Arabs arrived, there was almost certainly nothing left to burn. What was actually lost is impossible to know precisely, but the fragments give some sense of the scale. We have 7 of Sophocles' roughly 120 plays. We have fragments of Sappho's poetry that suggest she was considered the equal of Homer. But the vast majority of her work is gone. Entire scientific traditions, philosophical schools, and literary genres are known to us only through references in surviving texts, shadows of works that once existed in full on the library's shelves. The lesson of Alexandria is not that knowledge was destroyed by barbarians at the gates. It is that knowledge is always more fragile than it appears. The library did not need an enemy with a torch. It needed funding, political support, and a culture that valued what it contained. When those things disappeared, the scrolls became just objects, and objects decay. Every library, every archive, every database exists only as long as someone considers it worth maintaining. Alexandria reminds us that the default state of knowledge is not preservation, it is loss.